This Arduino project is the Touchy lamp. In this project we are introduced into touch sensing, and we'll be utilizing a capacitive sensor library to deal with this. This capacitive sensor library allows us to measure the capacitance of our bodies. The capacitive library is actually our special device, and we'll be going over that more in depth later on. The general overview of this project is to create a lamp that turns on when we touch a piece of conductive material. Like in our case, we will be using a small piece of aluminum foil. Then we'll also discover how this sensor will still work with insulative material in the mix. Here's a picture of what our project will look like with the breadboard. Let me see. Now for the hardware, we'll be using the Arduino breadboard of course. The actual build and setup of this project is fairly simple and does not really require much setup or prep time. It's mostly the capacitive sensor library and code that does majority of the work. But for the hardware, aside from the breadboard, we will need an LED light, 2 resistors, some of the wiring, and then a conductive piece of material. Now, one of the resistors we'll be using is a mega ohm resistor. This will make it so that our sensor requires a touch to activate. We did a little research on the resistors, and we noted that if we were to swap out the mega ohm resistor with like a 10 mega ohm or a higher resistor, then the touch sensor would become more sensitive than it is now and would actually start to react with no touch at all. The light would turn on if your hand was just close to the sensor without actually touching it. Then then there's the conductive piece of material. Again, we used a piece of aluminum foil. Just for the beginning, we used a small piece of aluminum foil, and then later on with this project, we actually, through our extension, we will be using a bigger sheet of aluminum foil. When we got to the software part of this project, we learned that the capacitive sensor library was the most crucial part of our program. However, in order to use it, we first had to download the file to our computer, since it had not already been done so already. Now, in order to do that, didn't take the greatest picture, but here's kind of like a example of it. When we downloaded it and just put it into the file Arduino, we would then get this little pop-up towards the end right here where it says Arduino libraries capacitive sensor, just an extra tool that we'd be able to use. After that was downloaded, we were able to start writing our code. Now when we begin writing our code, you can see this part right here is what will kind of implement what we just downloaded, that capacitive sensor library. It's going to be our first command. And then this guy right here, or this following command, is to let basically our program know that what pins we'll be using to send and receive information. The next piece of code right here establishes the threshold we will be setting for our program. And then so that just kind of, actually this threshold, we can mess around with that number higher or lower to kind of test the functionality of our sensor, if it's more sensitive, less sensitive. And then we have this piece of code. It basically, simple enough, just tells our program which pin will be having our LED light. Then the next piece of code identifies the number of samples we'll be wanting to use, so this whole thing right here. But the main part of it really is just letting our program know how many samples we want the sensor to pick up. So the book notes that only a few samples will possibly give us a lot of variation in the sensor, and too many samples could also introduce a lag as it reads. So it was recommended that we use a sample size of 30 as a good starting point. Now this last piece of code, this right here, is basically going to be our if-else statement. So simply put, this code is what will determine if the LED light turns on or not. If the sensor value is above our threshold that we set, then the light will turn on. If that sensor value is below, then the light will not turn on. We'll go ahead now and take a look at our project's final build. Got it right here. Now on our breadboard you can see our LED light right here. It's connected up to pin 12 and its cathode is connected up, RSU is grounded through this 220 ohm resistor right here. And our digital pins 2 and 4 down below here also connect up onto our breadboard. Then connecting those two is this mega ohm resistor right here that we had discussed earlier in this video, and on the same row as the two pin, we have this long wire extending out from our breadboard that connects up to our piece of aluminum foil, which so this was what became our sensor. And then this digital pin 4 right here is what sends the current through to the sensor, and then whenever we touch the sensor and it registers a sensor value over our threshold, it will turn the LED light on. Now I do apologize because due to user error on my part, we were unable to provide a video of this this setup, but we were able to find a video, show you a quick little video just so you can see what it was supposed to look like real quick. So on this video you'll see the guy touching the sensor down below right here and the LED light just flicking on and off. See how it goes on and off as he's touching it. Simple enough. Also just wanted to point out, or just show, it's important to note as well that to make sure when setting up our breadboard that you get the right pins connected up to it, because that's what corresponds to the code. So if you have anything that's kind of like off, basically it won't work. Alright, now we'll go ahead and take a look at the extensions our project had listed for us. Alright, so now we know in order for our LED light to turn on, it requires some type of touch or recognition of the body. And so for our extensions, it was to note the change in the sensor value when more of our body was touching the conductive material. So we found that the more surface area we covered over the aluminum foil, the higher our sensor value got. Now another extension was to note that what would happen if we changed the resistor connecting pins 2 and 4. Now we mentioned this earlier, but just to kind of reiterate, changing this resistor that connects pins 2 and 4 would overall affect the sensitivity of our sensor. So a higher resistor would make it more sensitive, and a lower resistor would make it less sensitive, just meaning you would have to touch it harder. Now the last extension we had was a pretty interesting one, and it was to add insulative material to our sensor. Now this was interesting because even though the material itself was an insulator, the sensor still would be able to sense our finger whenever we would touch it, even though we were not directly touching the conductor material itself. So we were able to put a piece of paper over our foil sensor, touch the paper, and the light would still turn on. Now we'll go ahead and discuss the device we used in our Touchy project, which was our capacitive sensor library. We can see here that the book defines for us capacitance as the measure of how much electrical charge something can store. And this capacitive sensor library that we downloaded ended up turning our two Arduino pins into a capacitive sensor, which, along with our code, allowed it to sense the electrical capacitance of our bodies whenever we were touching our sensor. And the way Arduino does this is by measuring how much time the capacitor or our sensor takes to charge while we're touching it. So to kind of conclude and wrap up our Touchy lamp Arduino project, all it really was just kind of downloading this capacitive sensor library into Arduino, building our breadboard setup, and then writing our code to get it all working together, and then created our little sensor with aluminum foil. And all it did was register any touch that was given, and then what that touch would do would give a sensor value. Then whenever that sensor value was higher than the threshold we set for it, the light would turn on. And then just the kind of the other things to note is that when you mess with certain variables of like the setup we have, like we can switch out this resistor right here, or use different material like insulator materials on top of this conductive material, and still you'd be able to turn the light on and be able to do basically different things with it if you kind of switch around and mess with it. But overall, it would still turn the light on as long as it just registers a touch greater than our threshold. The only thing that would happen if you changed around the certain variables in this setup, it would just affect the overall sensitivity of our touch sensor.